The truth they don't tell about women in war me that her scars did not bleed, but they burned. She had lost 3 brothers to the front, and yet when she spoke of the war, she spoke only of the night she sat in silence, waiting for footsteps that never came. "It is not the gunfire that haunts me," she said. "It is the silence after." That silence was heavier than bombs, heavier than hunger. It was the silence between stories, the silence where women lived. In the official accounts, women are footnotes, a line about nurses, a sentence about mothers waiting at home. But those lines cannot contain the truth. They cannot show the woman who dug through rubble with bare hands to find her child. They cannot capture the mother who starved herself so her son could eat. They cannot tell of the daughter who stitched messages into her skirt, walking through streets where discovery meant death. These stories are absent because they do not fit into the neat frames of heroism. They are too raw, too ordinary, too uncomfortable, but silence does not mean absence. Women's scars speak even without words. They live in the way women still hoard food decades later, still flinch at sudden noises, still press their children too tightly to their chests. They live in lullabies sung in kitchens, lullabies once hummed in cellars during bombings. They live in hands that tremble when folding letters, hands that remember too much. The silence between stories is not empty. It is full, heavy, alive. I often think of the women who could not speak because no one would listen. After the war, men told their tales in pubs and parades. Women's truths were met with dismissal. If they spoke of hunger, they were told everyone was hungry. If they spoke of fear, they were told to be grateful they survived. If they spoke of violation, they were told to keep silent for the sake of honor. And so they swallowed their words, burying them in their bodies, where they festered into scars. The truth they don't tell about women in war is not only what happened, but why it was silenced. The silence between stories is also generational. Mothers did not tell daughters everything, but daughters felt it anyway. They felt it in the way their mother's eyes lingered too long on them, as if memorizing their faces. They felt it in the way their mothers jumped at thunder, in the way they never wasted bread, in the way they hid tears when songs of home were sung. Children inherited the silence, carrying it like a secret passed down in glances. I carry that silence too. I was told stories of battles, but my memories are of my mother's face when the subject of the war arose. Her mouth would tighten. Her hands would fold neatly in her lap. Her eyes would glaze as though looking into another world. I would wait, but she never spoke. Only once, when I was older, did she whisper, "Our stories were not for telling." I did not understand then. Now I do. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that silence was not always choice. It was survival. To speak of hunger, of loss, of violation, was to risk breaking apart. To remain silent was to keep standing, to keep caring for children, to keep rebuilding homes. Silence became armor, but armor corrodes. It eats into the skin. It leaves scars deeper than wounds, and yet even in silence, truth finds ways to live. In songs hummed softly, in prayers whispered over empty beds, in recipes stretched from nothing, in hands that plant seeds in soil still heavy with ash. Women's survival was its own testimony, even if unspoken. Their silence was not absence, but presence in another form, a presence history has ignored. I think of history books with their neat timelines, battles, treaties, leaders. Between those lines is the space where women lived. Those spaces are where truth hides. The silence between stories is where the scars are. And if we dare to listen closely, we will hear them still. The lullabies behind wire, the laughter forced in basements, the sobs muffled into pillows. The silence between stories is not the end of history. It is its beginning. It is the truth they don't tell, that women bore war in ways the world never honored, never acknowledged, never recorded. Their scars remain unhealed because no one gave them voice. And yet those scars speak still, through daughters, through grandchildren, through habits and fears that echo generations later. This is the beginning of the truth. Not the one carved in stone, but the one etched in silence. The truth of women who lived war, not in uniforms or medals, but in hunger and shadows, in loss and endurance, in scars that never fade. Wars are fought over land, over borders, over power. That is what history tells us. But the truth they don't tell is that for women, the battlefield was often their own bodies. Flesh became territory. Skin became soil. Wombs became weapons and trophies. The body was not only a vessel of survival, but a space of conquest, invasion, and resistance. And this truth has been silenced, hidden in shame, dismissed as unworthy of history's pages. I remember a woman who lived 2 streets away during the war. She was strong, with hands rough from fieldwork and a laugh that filled the air like bells. But one night soldiers came, and when morning broke, her laughter was gone. She never spoke of it, but the silence in her house was unbearable. It was the silence of a battlefield after destruction, a silence that carried the weight of things that cannot be spoken. Her scar was not visible, but it glowed in her eyes, in the way she never laughed again. The truth they don't tell is that women endured invasions more intimate than any army's march. They were forced into silence by shame, by fear of rejection, by the cruelty of being blamed for their own violation. These wounds did not bleed on the battlefield for all to see. They bled in bedrooms, in cellars, in shadows. And because they were hidden, the world pretended they did not exist. Yet they shaped lives, generations, families. They were scars that never healed because they were never allowed to be acknowledged. Mothers carried these scars into their children's lives. Some bore children they did not choose, born of violence, born of war's cruelty. And still they raised them, fed them, rocked them to sleep. Their scars spoke every time they looked into the child's eyes, seeing both life and pain. The world calls this survival, but survival is not clean. It is tangled in contradictions, in love woven with grief, in care that hurts. This is the battlefield no history book records. I think of my mother's silence when people asked why she never spoke of certain nights. She would look away, her lips pressed shut, her shoulders stiff. She never told me what happened, but her body told me anyway. The way she flinched at sudden touches, the way she avoided mirrors, the way she held herself small in crowded rooms. Her body carried scars that words could not reach. The truth they don't tell is that women became both weapons and shields. Some starved themselves so children could live. Some used their bodies to distract soldiers, to protect others hidden nearby. Some bore pain in silence, turning their own suffering into a wall so others would be spared. These acts were never honored, never remembered, but they were as much a part of survival as any battle won with guns. For men, scars were medals. For women, scars were shame. A man could roll up his sleeve, show his wound, and be called brave. A woman could not. Her scars were hidden, locked inside her body, spoken only in whispers if spoken at all. And so her battlefield was erased, her war dismissed, her survival diminished. But scars do not stay silent forever. They speak in the way women raise their daughters, teaching them caution, teaching them silence, teaching them how to shrink themselves in the presence of danger. They speak in the way women guard their bodies, in the way they carry themselves, in the way they mistrust the world. These are the echoes of battles fought on bodies, passed down without words. I met a woman years later who told me she had been marked by soldiers. She said it quietly, without tears, as if telling me the weather. Her face was calm, her voice steady, but her eyes burned. She said, "They thought they conquered me, but I lived. That is my victory." Her scar was not healing, but resistance. Her body had been battlefield, but it was also proof that she endured. The truth they don't tell is that women turned their bodies into sanctuaries too. Even after violation, even after hunger, even after scars, they carried life forward. They bore children, they fed families, they embraced lovers again. They did not heal, but they refused to vanish. Their scars became voices, even when mouths remained silent. I remember standing in front of a mirror as a child, tracing the faint line on my leg from shattered glass. I thought of my mother, of other women, of scars they carried that I could not see. I realized then that scars are not always on skin. Some live deep, hidden in bone, in womb, in memory. And those are the ones that shape us most. The body as battlefield is a truth history cannot erase, though it has tried. It is written into generations, into silence, into the way women move through the world. And though no medals were pinned to their scars, those scars remain as testimony louder than parades, heavier than monuments. The truth they don't tell about women in war is not only what was done to them, but how they carried it, how they endured, how they transformed even wounds into survival. Their bodies bore battles no one saw, scars no one honored, and yet those scars remain, unhealed, unforgotten, undeniable. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that motherhood became both salvation and torment. War stripped mothers of the very essence of what it meant to nurture. Cradles stood empty, rocking only with the wind that slipped through shattered windows. Children grew thin, their cheeks hollow, their laughter fading into silence. Mothers carried them in arms too weary, on backs too frail, in dreams too fragile. And when they lost them, the world expected them to keep moving, as if a womb could ever stop mourning. I remember my mother's hands more than her face. Her hands were always working, stirring thin soup, mending torn clothes, covering our ears when bombs fell. They were hands that never rested, because children could not wait for peace. And yet, there were nights when her hands trembled as she touched our cheeks, as though memorizing us in case the morning never came. Her hands told the truth history did not, that every mother lived with the terror of losing the only thing she had left to protect. The empty cradle became a symbol I could never forget. After one air raid, our neighbor's house collapsed. In the rubble, there was a cradle, half buried in dust. Its wood was splintered, its blanket torn. The child who once slept there was gone, but the cradle remained, mute and accusing. For days, the mother sat beside it, her body still, her eyes hollow. No one dared to move her. The war had taken her child, but she clung to the cradle as if it still breathed. That image carved itself into me. A mother without a cradle is a scar the world cannot bear to see, and so it chooses to forget. The truth they don't tell is that some mothers became cradles themselves. With no wood, no cloth, no bed, they carried their children in their arms day and night, refusing to let them touch the cold ground. Their backs bent, their shoulders ached, their skin bruised, but they did not put them down. They whispered, "As long as I hold you, you are alive." Their arms became the cradle, their bodies the last sanctuary. Their scars were the pain in their spines, the tremor in their muscles, the ache that never left even after the war. Hunger gnawed at children first. Mothers tried to shield them, giving away their own portions, lying with smiles that said, "I'm not hungry." But the body cannot lie forever. Their cheeks hollowed, their milk dried, their lullabies grew weaker. And still they sang. That was the most painful scar, to sing when you had no strength, to soothe a child you knew you could not save. No medal exists for such endurance, yet it was more heroic than any battle. The truth they don't tell is that some mothers gave birth in ruins. No hospital, no midwife, only the sound of bombs as background to a child's first cry. I once witnessed such a moment. A woman in our cellar gave birth by candlelight, her teeth clenched to keep from screaming, her hands gripping the earth. When the baby came, the sound of crying filled the darkness. We all wept. For one moment, life dared to enter death's territory. That baby was a scar and a miracle, proof that even in destruction, life refused silence. But war is cruel. Some mothers did not live to see their children grow. Disease, starvation, violence, they fell, leaving behind infants who would never know their touch. Other women took those children in, creating families woven not by blood, but by survival. Motherhood stretched beyond biology, becoming a collective act. A child was fed by whichever breast still had milk, carried by whichever arm still had strength. And yet each borrowed act was a scar, a reminder of mothers gone, of loss stitched into every gesture of care. I remember my mother saying once, "I am both cradle and grave." I did not understand then. Later, I realized she meant that in her arms she carried both life and loss. She had seen too many children die. She had buried too many small bodies. She carried the weight of absence alongside the weight of survival. Her womb had given life, but war had stolen it away. That contradiction lived in her eyes until the day she died. The truth they don't tell is that many women were forced to abandon their children. Soldiers stormed homes, families fled, and in chaos, mothers made impossible choices. Some placed babies in strangers' arms, whispering, "Take them, save them." Some left children in convents, in barns, in doorways, praying someone kinder than war would find them. Those choices scarred them more deeply than any wound. To walk away from your child is to walk away from your soul. And yet, survival demanded it. Years later, I met a woman who confessed she had left her child in a church during an air raid. She never saw her again. Every day since, she said, I have been both mother and ghost. Her scar was not the absence of a child's body, but the constant presence of memory. A cradle she still rocked in her dreams, a lullaby she still hummed in empty rooms. And then there were the mothers who raised children of war, children born of violence, children who reminded them daily of nights they wanted to forget. Some could not bear it. Others did, transforming pain into love, refusing to let war define the child. But even love could not erase the scar. It lived in glances, in hesitations, in secrets never spoken. These children carried the war in their very existence, proof of wounds no one acknowledged. The empty cradle is not only an object, it is a metaphor, a wound in wood and memory. It represents what war does to women. It robs them of motherhood or twists it into torment. And yet, women filled those empty cradles with endurance. They rocked nothing and still sang. They held absence as if it were presence. They refused to let the silence consume them. Their scars became lullabies, lullabies that reached across generations. I carry those lullabies still. When I sing to my own children, I hear my mother's voice beneath mine, trembling but steady, carrying me through nights of fear. Her song was her scar, her way of telling the truth without words. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that motherhood was war. To give life in a world obsessed with death, to nurture in a world that starved, to love when loss was inevitable, this was battle. Mothers without cradles fought every day, and though their scars remain, their survival is the reason any of us are here to remember. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that many of them were soldiers without uniforms, warriors without recognition. They carried no rifles, their boots left no prints in military reports, their names were never recorded on monuments. Yet without them, resistance would have faltered, survival would have failed. They were invisible soldiers, moving through shadows, disguising courage as routine, disguising rebellion as silence. I remember one woman from our street who always carried a basket of bread. To the soldiers who marched by, she was nothing more than a baker's wife. They laughed at her bent back, ignored her weary steps. But hidden inside the loaves were slips of paper, coded messages, names of safe houses, warnings of raids. She walked calmly through checkpoints, her apron dusted with flour, her eyes lowered. No one suspected her. She was invisible, and that invisibility was her weapon. The truth they don't tell is that invisibility itself was a form of strategy. Women were dismissed as weak, as irrelevant, as incapable of danger. And so they moved freely where men could not. They listened to conversations soldiers thought unworthy of secrecy. They carried news in whispered lullabies, in patterns of stitching, in the way laundry hung on a line. Their bodies became networks of communication, their silence a language of survival. Some carried weapons hidden in baskets, under shawls, strapped against their legs. Others carried food to partisans in forests, walking miles with empty stomachs, never betraying the pain in their steps. Some guided fugitives through alleys in the dark, risking their homes, their children, their lives. They fought not with guns but with presence, with the audacity to remain unseen. Their scars were not medals, but nights of sleepless fear, mornings of pretending nothing had happened, years of silence that weighed heavier than any rifle. I once overheard a woman whispering to another, "Our camouflage is our womanhood." It was true. Soldiers looked through them, not at them. They were shadows in kitchens, figures at wells, hands kneading bread. But behind those ordinary gestures was extraordinary defiance. They were invisible only to those who chose not to see. To each other, they were beacons, signals, allies. Their eyes met, and courage passed like a torch. The truth they don't tell is that invisibility came with a price. If caught, women were punished not only as enemies, but as traitors to the roles imposed upon them. Some were beaten in public squares, accused of dishonor. Some were executed without trial, their bodies left as warnings. Others were humiliated, stripped of dignity before death. Their scars were carved not only by violence, but by betrayal of the world's refusal to see them as what they were, soldiers. And yet, even after death, their invisibility persisted. History forgot their names, erased their acts, silenced their memory. Men's battles were written in books. Women's battles vanished in smoke. But invisibility does not mean absence. It means we must look harder, listen deeper, uncover the scars hidden beneath silence. I remember my mother telling me of a cousin who joined the resistance. She never wore a uniform, never held a rank. But she delivered messages, guided men through forests, carried stolen supplies. One night she did not return. Her body was never found. In the family, they spoke of her as though she had simply disappeared, her name avoided like a curse. But my mother told me once, quietly, She fought harder than most men. She was a soldier, though no one called her that. Her scar is the silence in her memory, the way even her courage was erased. Invisible soldiers carried survival in their hands. They lit stoves for children in bombed houses, shared scraps of bread with neighbors, carried water from wells under fire. Each act was small, ordinary, but together they were defiance. They were refusal to let war consume everything. Their battlefield was not trenches but kitchens, not maps but doorsteps, not rifles but hands. Their scars were invisible too, but they shaped generations more than any victory speech. The truth they don't tell is that invisibility was not weakness. It was strategy, it was survival, it was power hidden in plain sight. Women transformed the very fact of being overlooked into a weapon. They endured humiliation, dismissal, erasure, and used it to move unseen, to act without detection, to carry truth where truth was forbidden. Their scars remind us that invisibility is not the absence of strength, but the refusal to let strength be defined by others. I think of them often. The women who walked with baskets of bread that were more than bread. The women who hummed songs that were more than lullabies. The women whose silence was louder than cannons. They were invisible soldiers, and their scars remain even if their names do not. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that invisibility was their camouflage, but also their curse. They fought bravely, but the world looked away. They survived fiercely, but history stayed silent. Yet their scars speak now, if we are willing to listen. They remind us that wars are not won only by those whose names are remembered. They are also endured by those whose names are forgotten. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that hunger was a battlefield as cruel as any front line. It was not fought with rifles or bombs, but with empty bowls, with gnawing stomachs, with lips that lied to children saying, "I am full." Hunger carved scars into bodies and souls, scars that never faded, scars passed like inheritance from one generation to the next. I remember hunger more vividly than fire. Bombs came and went, leaving destruction in their wake, but hunger lingered day after day, tightening its grip. It gnawed slowly, turning hours into torment, nights into endless waiting for food that never came. Hunger was the enemy that never slept, never retreated, never signed peace. Women bore this war in silence. They stood in lines that stretched for hours, only to return with nothing. They boiled water with weeds, made soup from grass, ground acorns into bitter flour. They stretched one potato into 3 meals, one crust into a feast. Their scars were not only thin faces and trembling hands, but the lies they told their children, the way they smiled while their insides screamed with emptiness. The truth they don't tell is that women chose hunger for themselves to spare others. A mother would divide bread into portions, giving the largest to her children, the smallest to her husband, leaving herself with crumbs. She would claim she had already eaten, pressing her lips tightly to keep her stomach from betraying her. Her body thinned, her eyes hollowed, but she kept standing. That standing was resistance, a refusal to let hunger devour her family. I remember my mother sitting at the table with us, watching us eat. She smiled faintly, her plate empty. At the time, I believed her lie. She told us she wasn't hungry. Only years later did I understand that her hunger had never left her. Even decades later, when food filled our shelves, she ate little, as though afraid to take too much, as though saving it for someone else. Her scar was not in her stomach, but in her habits, in the way hunger rewrote her life forever. Hunger also turned neighbors into strangers. Families argued over scraps. Trust vanished when food was scarce. But women more often than not still shared. A mother who had lost her own child fed another's. A widow divided her last crust between children not her own. Hunger stripped people bare, but women stitched humanity back together, one bite at a time. Their scars were the constant question. Do I give away what I need to survive? And too often, the answer was yes. Some women traded everything they had for food, clothes, jewelry, even their dignity. They endured shame so their children would not starve. History does not tell this truth. It prefers to look away from the hunger that forced such choices. But those scars remained, hidden in silence, in eyes that refused to meet mirrors, in children who never understood the cost of their survival. Hunger left marks on bodies too. Children grew with bones too fragile. Women lost their teeth early, hair thinned, skin dulled. Some never recovered, their health permanently broken. And yet, even in fragile bodies, they carried on. They planted gardens in rubble, stole seeds, nursed plants like children. Hunger taught them to conjure life from nothing, to make miracles out of ashes. The truth they don't tell is that hunger shaped generations. Children who grew up starving became adults who hoarded food, who panicked when cupboards were bare, who could never waste a crumb. Their children inherited the fear too, even if they never knew hunger themselves. Trauma travels in silence, in gestures, in invisible scars. A woman's empty stomach in 1942 echoes in her granddaughter's hand reaching for bread today. I once met a woman who told me she still hid food under her mattress. She had survived a camp where hunger ruled every breath. Decades later, with kitchens full, she still could not sleep without bread close to her. Her scar was not the hunger itself, but the memory of it, etched so deeply that it shaped every night of her life. Hunger's war was also spiritual. Women prayed over empty bowls, begging God to turn water into milk, crumbs into loaves. Some lost faith entirely, unable to believe in a God who let children starve. Others clung tighter to faith, whispering blessings over weeds turned into soup. Their scars were written in their prayers, prayers that sometimes felt like screams. I remember my sister crying one night, begging for food. My mother rocked her, singing softly, telling her stories of feasts that would come tomorrow. My sister fell asleep, still hungry but soothed by the song. That song was a scar too, a scar in sound, a lullaby woven with lies and love. Hunger did not end when the war ended. Its scars remained. Women who starved once never trusted abundance. They ate quickly, hiding bites, saving leftovers. They taught their children to finish every crumb, to never waste, to always save. Their bodies carried hunger in wrinkles, in bones, in habits. Their souls carried it in silence. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that hunger was not absence. It was presence, heavy and cruel. It shaped every decision, every sacrifice, every scar. Women fought hunger as fiercely as men fought battles. And though their victories were never celebrated, they were victories nonetheless. Every child fed, every body kept alive, every garden grown in rubble was a triumph. Hunger was hidden war, silent war, a war without parades or medals. But it was war, and women fought it daily. Their scars tell us so. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that even after surviving hunger, loss, and violence, they were burdened with a weight that was not theirs to bear: shame. It was placed on their shoulders by silence, by communities that refused to listen, by families that preferred to forget, by societies that found it easier to blame than to honor. Their scars were not only wounds, they were accusations. They carried not only what was done to them, but the guilt of being made to feel complicit in their own suffering. I remember my mother's voice lowering when certain topics arose. Neighbors whispered behind doors about what had been done to some women when soldiers came. Those women never spoke of it themselves. They kept their eyes down, their hands busy, their mouths closed. They carried shame like a second skin, invisible yet suffocating. It was not their shame, but the shame forced upon them by others' cruelty and others' cowardice. The truth they don't tell is that women violated in war were treated as though they had sinned. Instead of compassion, they were met with silence. Instead of justice, they were met with avoidance. Husbands turned away, families distanced themselves, communities whispered. The scars of violence were compounded by the scars of abandonment. Survival became condemnation. Their bodies had been battlefields, but instead of honor, they received shame. I knew a woman who carried this burden for decades. She was taken by soldiers one night and returned the next morning, walking slowly, her face pale, her dress torn. She never spoke of it. She never married. In our village, people avoided her eyes, as if what happened was her fault. Children were told not to ask. Adults pretended not to see. Her scar was not only the violence, but the isolation. She lived alone until she died, buried with no one to speak her truth. The shame they were forced to carry also extended to motherhood. Women who bore children of war carried double scars, the memory of the violation and the presence of a child who reminded them of it daily. Some loved those children fiercely, transforming shame into care. Others struggled, caught between tenderness and torment. Society judged them harshly either way. If they abandoned the child, they were condemned. If they raised the child, they were pitied in whispers. Shame followed them, no matter their choice. And yet, the truth is that these women endured more courageously than most. To live with shame not your own is to fight a war every day, long after the guns fall silent. To look into a mirror and see not yourself but the cruelty of others reflected back is to carry a scar heavier than any visible wound. But they did. They woke each morning, they worked, they cared for others. They lived, even when the world told them they should hide. I remember once asking my grandmother why some women in the village always sat at the edge of gatherings, silent, heads lowered. She told me, "They carry things we cannot speak of." I did not understand then. Later, I realized they were the ones marked not only by violence, but by society's refusal to honor them. They had been abandoned to silence, forced to carry shame that was never theirs. The truth they don't tell is that shame was used as another weapon of war. Soldiers knew it would silence women, fracture families, poison communities. Violence against women was not just cruelty, it was strategy. To humiliate, to dominate, to leave scars deeper than ruins. And societies, unwilling to confront that truth, became complicit. They chose silence over recognition, judgment over compassion, forgetting over remembering. But shame cannot erase truth. It lingers, it festers, it passes into generations. Daughters inherit their mother's silences, granddaughters inherit their mother's fears. A woman who cannot speak of what was done to her still teaches her children caution, mistrust, withdrawal. Shame becomes a legacy, invisible but powerful, shaping lives long after the war. I once heard a woman say, "They tried to bury me in shame, but I kept breathing." Her voice was quiet but steady. She had endured whispers, rejection, isolation, but she still stood, still lived, still carried her scar openly. That refusal to vanish was itself defiance. Shame was meant to erase her, but she turned it into survival. The shame they were forced to carry is perhaps the cruelest scar of all, because it was avoidable. It was not inevitable like hunger, not unavoidable like bombs. It was inflicted by society's choice to turn away, to silence, to condemn. It was betrayal layered on top of violence. And yet, women carried it, endured it, survived it. Their strength was not in healing, because some wounds cannot heal, but in refusing to vanish under the weight of imposed shame. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that shame was never theirs. It belonged to those who violated, to those who ignored, to those who judged. But history misplaced it, laying it on the shoulders of survivors. And still, those women carried it with dignity, their silence louder than history's lies. Their scars remain not as proof of shame, but as proof of survival. Proof that even when the world turned against them, they endured. Proof that truth cannot be erased, even if it is silenced. Proof that the shame they were forced to carry is not theirs, but ours. Ours to acknowledge, ours to remember, ours to finally set down. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that songs carried more than melody. They carried memory, resistance, survival. When words could not be spoken, when truth was forbidden, when silence pressed against every wall, women sang. Their voices rose softly at first, trembling in the dark, then stronger, weaving through fear, carrying stories no book would ever keep. These songs became scars in sound, haunting, unfinished, echoing long after the singers were gone. I remember the first time I heard my mother hum during a night raid. We were huddled in a cellar, the air heavy with dust, children whimpering in the dark. She began to sing a lullaby, her voice low, almost a whisper. The melody was familiar, one she had sung to me before the war, but in that moment it was different. It was not just comfort, it was defiance. Each note said, "You cannot take everything from us." The bombs thundered above, but her song cut through the noise, fragile and steady. That night, her song carried me through fear, stitching memory into my heart like thread into torn cloth. The truth they don't tell is that women turned songs into shields. They used them to drown out the cries of hunger, to cover the silence after loss, to keep children asleep when fear might have consumed them. They sang old folk songs, prayers turned into melodies, invented tunes on the spot. Sometimes they had no words, only humming, a vibration of survival. Their scars were woven into those sounds, their pain carried on every trembling note. In the camps, women sang too. Behind barbed wire, their voices rose in defiance, even when guards struck them down. A friend once told me of a night when the women in her barrack began to sing together. The guards shouted, beat them, but they would not stop. For a moment, she said, we were free. Our bodies were trapped, but our voices were not. That memory became her scar, both beautiful and unbearable. Some songs carried coded messages. Resistance hid instructions in rhythm, warnings in verses, hope in refrains. Women stitched rebellion into melody, teaching each other quietly, passing songs like contraband. The enemy heard only tunes. The women heard survival. Their scars became notes, their defiance harmonies. But not all songs were for hope. Some were for mourning. When someone disappeared, when a child died, when a mother was lost, women sang softly in the dark. Without coffins, without graves, their songs became funerals. Names were woven into melodies, loss carried in verses, memory stitched into sound. The songs were scars that refused forgetting, keeping the dead alive in echoes. I once asked my grandmother why she sang while working, even when her voice trembled. She said, "Because silence is heavier." Her words became etched into me. Silence suffocates, but song gives breath. Even when it hurts, even when the melody carries pain, it is lighter than silence. That is the truth they don't tell. Women used songs to carry what silence could not. Some of those songs survived the war. They were passed to children, to grandchildren, often stripped of context. A lullaby sung in kitchens decades later carried memories of cellars and ruins, though the children listening never knew. Trauma traveled in melody, scars passing as tunes. A granddaughter might hum the same song, never realizing it once covered the sound of bombs. This is how scars echo across generations, not only in silence, but in song. And yet, not all women could sing. Some had their voices stolen. Fear pressed so heavily they could not hum, grief so deep they could not breathe melody. Their silence was also a song, though unvoiced. A song of absence, of pain too heavy for notes. That silence, too, was scar. The truth they don't tell is that women's voices were their first and last weapon. They soothed, they resisted, they remembered. Their voices carried life when bodies were breaking. They carried truth when history turned away. They carried hope when everything else was gone. These songs did not heal, nothing could, but they carried survival, and survival was enough. Even now, decades later, when I hear certain melodies, I am back in the cellar, back in the hunger, back in the silence broken only by song. The scar opens, but it also breathes, because those songs carried memory, and memory is heavier than silence, but lighter than forgetting. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that without their songs, memory would have died. It is not in history books, not in monuments, not in medals. It is in melodies hummed in the dark, in lullabies whispered to hungry children, in verses sung behind wire. Songs that carried memory, scars that refused to fade. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that the war did not end when the bombs stopped, when treaties were signed, when soldiers returned. It lived on in the bodies and souls of children, children who had seen too much, heard too much, starved too much, children who grew up too quickly, their innocence stolen, their laughter muted. They carried the war forward, not in uniforms or medals, but in memories that shaped their lives and the lives of those who came after. They were the heirs of scars. I remember my own childhood as fragments: the sound of boots in the street, the shattering of glass, the tremor in my mother's hands as she held me close. I was too young to understand, but I was old enough to remember. And memory does not fade, it embeds itself into the bones. Even when peace came, the memories stayed. They surfaced in dreams, in sudden fears, in the way my body tensed at loud noises. Children inherit not only blood, but silence, gestures, shadows. The truth they don't tell is that women tried desperately to protect their children, to shield them from horror. They told stories, sang songs, invented games to distract from hunger. They whispered lies of comfort. The bombs are thunder. The soldiers will go away soon. Tomorrow there will be bread. But children always knew. They saw the tightness around their mother's eyes, heard the tremble in their voices, felt the tension in their embraces. They may not have understood the words, but they understood the fear. That fear became their scar, carved into their very being. Some children inherited hunger most of all. They grew with bellies twisted, bones fragile, bodies small for their age. Even when peace returned, they ate quickly, hoarded food, panicked at the sight of empty cupboards. Their mothers had given them their portions, but the habit of absence remained. They grew into adults who never wasted a crumb, who filled pantries obsessively, who taught their children to clean plates even when food was plentiful. Hunger became inheritance, passed not by choice but by survival. Other children inherited silence. Their mothers never spoke of certain nights, never answered certain questions, never told the full truth. But silence itself teaches. It becomes a language. Children learn not to ask, learn to keep secrets, learn that some truths are too heavy to carry. They grew up carrying silence as their own scar, unable to speak even when their lives were safer. Generations later, grandchildren felt the weight too, a silence passed down like an heirloom. Some children inherited shame. When their mothers were marked by violence, society whispered. Children grew up sensing that something unspoken clung to their family, something that made them different, stained. Even without words, they carried that shame, mistrusting the world, mistrusting themselves. The scars of their mothers became shadows in their own lives, shaping how they loved, how they feared, how they existed. I once knew a boy who never spoke of his father. People whispered that his father was a soldier, the enemy. His mother never confirmed, never denied. He grew with questions that gnawed at him, questions that became scars. He carried anger, confusion, shame. His scar was not a wound he could point to, but a silence that consumed him. The truth they don't tell is that children also inherited resilience. They saw their mothers endure hunger, loss, silence, and still stand. They learned strength not from lectures, but from example. They learned how to make much from little, how to sing in darkness, how to plant hope in rubble. These lessons became scars too, scars of endurance, scars of survival, scars that shaped them into people who could withstand storms. I remember my sister saying once, "I do not remember the bombs as much as I remember Mother's hands." She recalled the way our mother braided her hair even when water was scarce, the way she pressed bread into her hands with a smile she did not feel, the way she touched her cheek before sleep. Her hands, my sister said, were my shield. That memory became her scar, not the war itself, but the love that endured within it. Children inherited both pain and love, both silence and song, both hunger and resilience. Their lives became testaments to the contradictions of survival. They grew into adults who flinched at fireworks, who whispered lullabies to their own children without knowing why, who wept at songs they did not understand. The war lived in them, even if they had not chosen it. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that their scars did not stop with them. They passed into their children, into their grandchildren, into generations that never saw bombs but still felt their echoes. Trauma travels in blood, in gestures, in memories unspoken. But so does resilience. So does endurance. So does love. Children inherited the war, but they also inherited survival. And though their scars remain, those scars tell a truth history cannot erase. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that mirrors became enemies. Glass that once reflected beauty, youth, or dignity turned into silent witnesses of hunger, fear, and scars. Women who looked into them no longer recognized themselves. They saw shadows of who they had been, strangers with hollow cheeks and lifeless eyes. The mirror lied not because it showed something false, but because it showed only fragments, never the whole truth. It reflected the surface of scars, but not the survival beneath them. I remember the broken mirror shard in our cellar. It leaned against a wall, its edges jagged, salvaged from a shattered window. My mother used it to comb her hair in the mornings, even when she had no food to eat, even when her face was pale with exhaustion. She looked not with vanity, but with defiance. To face her reflection was to remind herself she still existed. But I also saw the way her eyes lingered too long, the way she bit her lip, the way she turned away quickly. The mirror did not lie. It told her she was no longer the woman she remembered. That truth was unbearable. The truth they don't tell is that women carried scars inside their reflections. A woman violated by soldiers looked into the mirror and saw not her own face, but the cruelty inflicted upon her. A mother who buried a child looked and saw absence behind her eyes. A girl who starved looked and saw a body no longer her own. The mirror told truths they did not want, truths they could not speak. And so many covered mirrors turned them against the wall, broke them. Better shards on the floor than a reflection you cannot bear. But mirrors also became tools of survival. Some women forced themselves to look, to confront the hollow cheeks and scarred skin, to whisper to themselves, "You are still here." Their scars glowed in glass, but so did their resilience. The mirror lied by showing only pain, but it also told the deeper truth, survival. A face in ruins is still a face alive. A scar is proof of endurance. I remember a neighbor who had a scar across her cheek from shrapnel. People whispered that she was ruined. She looked in the mirror each morning anyway, tying her hair with dignity, pressing her lips firmly. "This is my medal," she once said, tracing the scar with her finger. They wanted me gone. I remain. Her mirror reflected not shame but defiance. The lie was not in the glass. It was in the world that called her broken. The truth they don't tell is that mirrors reflected more than faces. They reflected silence. A woman stood before glass and saw all the words she could not speak, all the nights she could not name. Her reflection carried weight her voice could not. The mirror was both confessor and betrayer, keeper of secrets and revealer of wounds. It held memory in its stillness, pressing truth back onto the one who looked. Children, too, felt the mirror's cruelty. My sister once looked into that shard and cried, "I don't look like me," she said, touching her hollow cheeks. I wanted to smash it to save her from seeing. But I knew the mirror was not to blame. The war was. The mirror only spoke the truth. And sometimes truth cuts deeper than glass. Decades later, I still hesitate before mirrors. Part of me fears seeing the girl I was. Part of me fears not recognizing the woman I became. The mirror lies because it shows only surface. It cannot show the hunger carried in habits, the silence carried in breath, the fear carried in sleep. It cannot show the whole story. And yet, it insists on reflection, demanding we face ourselves, scars and all. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that mirrors became scars themselves. They etched pain into daily life, forcing confrontation with what survival had cost. But they also became symbols of refusal. A woman who faced her reflection was a woman who refused erasure. A woman who tied her hair in hunger, who washed her face in ashes, who stood before broken glass and still combed her hair. She was declaring, "I am still here." That is the truth no history book records. The mirror lied because it showed only the brokenness. But the deeper truth was always beyond the glass. Survival is not reflected, it is carried. And every woman who looked into a mirror during war knew this. Her scars were not shame. They were testimony. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that many of their voices were written down but never heard. Letters were composed in silence, scratched onto scraps of paper, folded carefully, hidden in aprons, tucked beneath floorboards, but never delivered. Words were their last act of defiance, but war intercepted them, burying truths beneath rubble and ash. Those unsent letters became scars of ink and silence, fragile testimonies that no one read, but that still lived in the hands that wrote them. I remember watching my mother write by candlelight. Her face was tense, her lips moving with words she dared not speak aloud. She wrote to her brother at the front, to a husband who might never return, to a God who seemed absent. She folded the paper, smoothed it with trembling hands, and hid it beneath the floorboard. I asked her why she didn't send it. She only said, "The letter is safer here than in the world." At the time, I didn't understand. Later, I realized the letter was not meant to reach him. It was meant to keep her alive. The truth they don't tell is that letters became confessions. Women poured onto paper the grief they could not voice, the hunger gnawing their children, the shame pressed into their skin, the terror of footsteps at night. They wrote truths that would have shattered them if spoken. In writing, they preserved themselves, even if no one ever read the words. Their scars were folded into those pages, ink carrying what silence could not. I once found a letter in the rubble of a neighbor's house. The paper was burned at the edges, the writing smudged with water or tears. It began, "If you read this, I am already gone." I never knew who wrote it or who it was meant for, but the letter itself became a ghost, a scar left behind. That piece of paper outlived its writer, outlived its purpose, carrying a truth that never reached its destination. The truth they don't tell is that many women wrote letters they never intended to send. They wrote to children too young to understand, to parents already gone, to lovers who would never return. Writing was a way of speaking without consequence, a way of breathing truth into paper so that it would not suffocate inside them. Those letters were prayers, not messages. They were survival, not communication. But some letters were intercepted. Soldiers found them, burned them, used them as evidence of resistance. Women risked everything with each word. A scrap of paper could condemn an entire family. And yet they wrote anyway. Their courage was not only in hiding fugitives or smuggling food, but in daring to put words to pain when silence was demanded. Every unsent letter was a rebellion against erasure. I remember a woman who kept a bundle of letters tied with string. They were to her husband, missing in the war. Each day she wrote, each day she folded, each day she placed the letter in the bundle. He never returned. The bundle grew thick, the paper yellowed, the ink faded. She never read them aloud. She kept them in a drawer, hidden, until she died. After her death, her children found them. They read her voice for the first time, decades too late. Her letters became her scar, carried forward into her children's memory. The truth they don't tell is that letters were also acts of hope. Women wrote as if the world might still hear them, as if the future might still exist. Even when bombs fell, they wrote of tomorrow. Even when hunger gnawed, they wrote of feasts to come. Even when they buried children, they wrote of life that must continue. Those letters, though never sent, carried faith that silence would not be the final word. Some women hid their letters in walls, in books, in cracks of furniture. Years later, they were found, brittle with age but alive with voice. These discoveries revealed truths history tried to bury: the intimate pain of women, the strength of their endurance, the depth of their scars. Each letter found was not just paper but testimony, a scar that refused to disappear. I once read in an archive a letter from a young girl in a camp. She wrote to no one in particular, perhaps to herself, "I am hungry. I'm afraid." But today, someone sang, and I remembered the sound of home. That letter was never delivered, but it survived. Her voice, silenced in life, lived in words. That letter is her scar, preserved for us to carry. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that the world is full of their unsent letters. Buried in ruins, burned in fires, hidden in drawers, lost in time, but present in spirit. Each one is a fragment of truth, a scar written in ink. They tell us what history did not: that women lived, suffered, endured, and refused to let silence consume them entirely. Letters that couldn't be sent are not failures. They are victories. They exist as proof that even in destruction, women spoke. Even if no one listened, they wrote. Even if no one read, they testified. Their scars are written still, waiting for us to unfold them, to hear them, to carry them forward. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that survival itself became a burden. To remain alive when so many did not was not relief, but weight. It pressed on the chest like a stone, heavier than hunger, heavier than rubble. Survival was supposed to be victory, yet for women it became another scar. The scar of being left behind, of breathing when others could not, of carrying the memory of those who vanished. I remember my mother after the war. She lived, but she was not free. She carried her survival like chains, every step haunted by names she could not speak. At night, she sat by the window, staring into the dark, her hands folded tightly in her lap. When I asked what she was thinking, she only said, "I am remembering." I did not understand then, but now I know. To survive is to remember constantly, to be unable to forget, to carry the lives of the dead within your own skin. The truth they don't tell is that women envied the dead sometimes. Not because they wished to die, but because death seemed lighter than survival. To keep living meant to carry hunger long after food returned, to carry silence long after the bombs stopped, to carry loss long after children were buried. Survival was a battlefield that never ended, a war that continued in the mind, in the body, in the soul. I once met a woman who said, "I am alive, but I do not live." She had lost her husband, her parents, 2 of her children. Only 1 child remained, and she dedicated every breath to him. But in her eyes, I saw emptiness. Her scar was survival itself, the knowledge that she was breathing in a world where most of her world had been erased. Survival had not freed her. It had imprisoned her. The weight of being alive showed itself in daily habits. Women who hoarded food decades later, unable to trust abundance. Women who woke at night to check doors and windows, though no soldiers marched outside. Women who wept at the sound of thunder, their bodies mistaking it for bombs. These scars were not choices. They were imprints of survival, reminders that life had continued, but not healed. The truth they don't tell is that many women lived 2 lives. The life outside, where they worked, raised children, laughed when expected, and the life inside, where grief and guilt gnawed endlessly. They carried both day after day, never letting one slip into the other. Their strength was extraordinary, but it came at a cost. The weight bent their backs, lined their faces, dimmed their eyes. Survival was visible not in joy, but in exhaustion. Some women carried the weight through faith. They believed survival was purpose, that they were chosen to live so they could remember, so they could testify. Their prayers were heavy, their songs solemn, but their belief gave them strength. Others rejected faith entirely, unable to forgive a God who let them survive while children died. Both paths were scars, etched in silence or in prayer, but never in healing. I remember a woman in our village who laughed loudly after the war, louder than anyone else. People thought she had healed, that she had moved on. But once, when she thought no one was listening, I heard her whisper, "I laugh because if I don't, I will die too." Her laughter was a mask, a shield against the weight she carried. Behind every smile was grief. Behind every joke was a scar. The truth they don't tell is that survival demanded forgetting, but forgetting was impossible. Women forced themselves to continue, to cook, to clean, to love again. But memory clung like smoke, staining everything. They carried photographs folded in pockets, letters hidden in drawers, lullabies sung without reason. They lived in the present, but their souls stayed in the ruins. Children noticed too. They saw the way their mothers held them too tightly, the way their eyes lingered too long, the way their silences stretched too deep. Children inherited not only the hunger and fear of war, but the heaviness of their mother's survival. They grew up under the shadow of ghosts, learning that life was fragile, that joy could vanish, that survival itself was uncertain. The weight passed through generations, invisible but crushing. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that living was not freedom. It was duty. It was memory. It was carrying the dead on their backs, day after day, without rest. Their scars were not wounds of flesh, but the exhaustion of breathing when so many could not. They bore it with dignity, with silence, with endurance. But it was weight, and it never left them. Survival is often painted as triumph. But for women, survival was a scar that whispered in the night, that trembled in their hands, that ached in their bones. A scar that reminded them every single day that they were alive, and that being alive was the heaviest burden of all. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that after the guns went silent, after the soldiers marched away, after the rubble cooled into dust, it was women's hands that built tomorrow. These hands were scarred, blistered, thinned by hunger, trembling from exhaustion. Yet they carried bricks, planted seeds, mended clothes, cradled children. They stitched a future together from scraps, from ashes, from nothing. And they did it without medals, without recognition, without history writing their names. I remember watching my mother's hands after the war. The nails cracked, the skin rough, the veins raised like rivers. She cooked with those hands, though there was little to cook. She mended shirts so thin they tore again with the next wear. She planted seeds in soil still smelling of smoke, whispering to them as if coaxing life itself. Her hands never rested, and when they finally did, they trembled as if still carrying weight. Those hands were scars, living proof of both destruction and survival. The truth they don't tell is that women rebuilt not only houses, but lives. They gathered children orphaned by war and raised them as their own. They found ways to reopen schools in ruins, teaching lessons on scraps of paper with broken pencils. They cleaned streets filled with glass, turning devastation into pathways. They rebuilt communities, one gesture at a time, long before governments restored order. Their scars were hidden in those tasks, in every blister, in every sleepless night. I once knew a woman who lost everything: husband, children, house. After the war, she moved into a shack with nothing but her hands. She began baking bread in an old stove, selling it to neighbors. With each loaf, she fed not only bodies, but hope. People said her bread tasted of ashes, but also of survival. She baked until her hands stiffened with age, until her body gave out. She left no statues, no writings, only the memory of bread in a time of hunger. Her scar was baked into every crust. The truth they don't tell is that women's hands carried memory forward. They touched the scars of children, combed their hair, pressed letters into their palms. They lit candles for the dead, crossed themselves in prayer, clapped softly in songs. Hands were voices when mouths could not speak. They trembled when silence was too heavy. They clenched when grief surged. They opened when love insisted on surviving. Women's hands became languages of endurance, silent but undeniable. And yet those hands were never honored. Men returned from war to parades and handshakes, their hands decorated with medals. Women's hands remained invisible, hidden in kitchens, in fields, in cradles. No one photographed them rebuilding walls. No one recorded them feeding neighbors. No one wrote their names in books. But without those hands, tomorrow would never have come. I remember my grandmother telling me, "We built the world, but the world forgot us." She said it with no bitterness, only truth. Her hands moved constantly as she spoke, sewing, cooking, working. She could not keep them still, as if still haunted by the war that demanded endless labor. Her scar was not only in memory, but in movement, hands that never stopped even when peace had returned. Children inherited those hands too. They learned resilience not from speeches, but from watching their mothers' fingers thread needles, their palms knead dough, their knuckles scrape against stone. They learned survival in gestures, in labor, in patience. Those lessons became scars too, shaping how they worked, how they endured, how they loved. The truth they don't tell is that women's hands built more than homes. They built dignity out of ruins. They washed faces even when water was scarce, braided hair even when combs were broken, swept floors even when dust returned the next day. These small acts were not trivial. They were resistance against erasure. Each gesture said, "We are still human. We are still here." I think often of the hands I held as a child. My mother's, calloused and warm. My neighbor's, trembling but steady. My sister's, small and fragile, clutching mine in the dark. Those hands carried me through war more than any soldier's rifle. They were my shield, my comfort, my survival. Their scars became my inheritance, pressed into my palms each time they held me. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that tomorrow was not built by treaties or speeches. It was built by hands that refused to stop moving, hands that carried life forward despite exhaustion. Their scars remain, etched not in monuments but in memory, in gestures passed from mother to daughter, in the silent endurance of work unseen. Hands that built tomorrow do not appear in history books. But they live in us, in the bread we eat, in the songs we hum, in the homes we inherit. They are scars we carry without knowing, scars that shaped the world silently, invisibly, endlessly. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that scars did not end with them. They traveled silently through veins, through lullabies, through habits and fears, through the very blood of generations that followed. Trauma does not stay still. It moves. It mutates. It hides in gestures, in silences, in shadows cast on children who never saw the war but grew up in its echo. These are scars passed through blood, unseen, unspoken, undeniable. I remember how my mother flinched at thunder. She never said why, never explained. But as a child, I too began to flinch, though I had not been there when the bombs fell. Her fear seeped into me, inherited without words. It lived in the tightening of her shoulders, in the quickness of her breath, in the way her hand instinctively reached for mine. Her scar became mine, carried in my body though it was not my wound. The truth they don't tell is that women transmitted survival in their very way of being. A mother who had starved taught her children never to waste food. A woman who had lost her home taught her children to always prepare for departure, to keep bags ready, to mistrust stability. A woman who had been silenced taught her children to speak carefully, to watch their words, to sense danger in every room. These lessons were not choices. They were scars carved into the marrow of families. I once met a woman who confessed she could not bear to see her daughter wear red. "It reminds me of blood," she said, her voice trembling. She had never told her daughter why, but the child grew up avoiding the color too, without knowing the reason. Trauma passes invisibly, embedding itself in ordinary things. A color, a sound, a smell becomes a scar, inherited like a curse. But scars passed through blood are not only pain. They are also resilience. A mother who sang through hunger gave her children the gift of song as shield. A grandmother who planted seeds in ashes gave her grandchildren the instinct to nurture life. A woman who carried silence still taught love through her hands, her cooking, her care. These too are scars, not wounds, but imprints of strength, survival encoded in the very blood that flowed forward. The truth they don't tell is that generations after war, grandchildren weep at songs they do not understand, shiver at shadows they never saw, feel hunger in abundance, silence in noise. They inherit scars like invisible tattoos, etched not on skin, but in soul. They carry the war without ever having lived it. This is the legacy of women's survival. Not chosen, not spoken, but unavoidable. I think of my own daughter. She never knew the war, yet she watches me closely when I grow quiet, sensing something she cannot name. She eats carefully, never wasting a bite, as though hunger might return. She hums lullabies I never taught her, melodies I thought I had forgotten, yet they live in her mouth. My scars pulse in her blood, alive in ways I never intended. The truth they don't tell is that women's bodies became both battlefield and archive. They carried not only wounds but memory itself, passing it into their children's bones. Memory written in silence, in habit, in instinct. History forgot them, but blood remembered. Blood keeps scars alive long after words fade. Some try to break the inheritance. Women who endured silence choose to speak, breaking cycles, daring to tell their daughters truths once buried. Others cannot. The silence is too heavy, the shame too deep. They pass it on anyway, even without wanting. The inheritance of scars is not always chosen. It is often unconscious. I once heard a young girl say, "I don't know why, but I feel I was there." She spoke of a war she had never lived, a hunger she had never felt, a silence she had never endured. But in her family's stories, or lack of stories, she carried it. That is how scars move, not only through blood, but through silence, through the spaces between words. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that their endurance did not end with them. It became part of us. We carry their scars unknowingly in the way we eat, the way we fear, the way we sing, the way we survive. Their pain became our foundation, their silence our inheritance, their resilience our shield. Scars passed through blood are not visible. They are lived. They are felt in the marrow, in dreams, in instincts. They are the war's echo, alive in us even when we think we are free. And perhaps that is the truest testimony of all, that women's scars did not vanish, that they continue to live in those who came after, refusing to let history forget. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that silence lasted for decades. For many, it lasted a lifetime. They folded their memories into locked drawers, swallowed their words like bitter medicine, disguised their scars beneath routine. But silence is never eternal. Somewhere, somehow, voices return. Sometimes in whispers, sometimes in sobs, sometimes in words trembling but unstoppable. The voice that finally spoke was not only a woman's liberation, it was history demanding to be heard. I remember the first time my mother broke her silence. It was years after the war, long after the rubble had been cleared, long after neighbors had stopped whispering. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she peeled potatoes. Without warning, she said, "I thought I would never live to see you grow." Her voice cracked, her eyes filled, and the room grew heavy with truths I had never heard. She did not say everything, but she said enough. That single sentence opened a door I had always sensed was locked. Her scar had spoken. The truth they don't tell is that when women finally spoke, their voices carried generations of weight. They spoke not only their own pain, but the pain of mothers, sisters, neighbors who never found the courage. Their words were never just individual. They were collective. They carried the silenced chorus of women erased from history. Each voice that broke free was a monument more powerful than any stone. Some women spoke through testimony, writing down memories for the first time. Their hands trembled, but their pens moved steadily, carving truth into paper before it was too late. Others spoke to grandchildren, breaking silence not for their children, who were too close to the wounds, but for those far enough to listen with tenderness. Their voices often began with, "I never told anyone this before." And from there, the dam of silence burst. I once attended a gathering of women survivors. They sat in a circle, their faces lined with years of unspoken truths. One by one, they shared fragments. The night soldiers came, the hunger that hollowed their children, the shame forced into their bodies. Their voices trembled, cracked, sometimes faltered into tears. But they kept speaking, and as each voice rose, the others nodded, their eyes shining. For the first time, they were not alone. Their scars had always been silent. That day, they became sound. The truth they don't tell is that when women spoke, the world often resisted. Some listeners turned away, uncomfortable with pain that did not fit into neat narratives of heroism. Some accused them of exaggeration, of weakness, of dishonoring the past. Speaking was not freedom, it was risk. But they spoke anyway. Their courage was not in surviving only, but in daring to tell survival's truth. Children too became witnesses. Sons and daughters who had grown under the shadow of silence suddenly heard the weight behind their mother's eyes. Some wept, some raged, some struggled to understand. But all were changed. The scars passed through blood-found words, and words reshaped inheritance. Memory became lighter when shared, though never gone. The voice that finally spoke did not erase pain. Scars do not vanish when named, but speaking transformed them. Silence is prison. Words are passage. To speak was to take ownership, to refuse shame, to say, "This happened and I remain." The scar was no longer just wound. It became testimony. I remember a woman who stood in front of a classroom of young students, her hands trembling as she began. She had never spoken before. Her voice was soft, almost fragile, but the room was silent, listening. She told them of hunger, of loss, of nights when she wished for death. And when she finished, she said, "Now it is yours to carry too." Her voice had passed the scar forward, not as silence, but as memory shared. The truth they don't tell is that when women spoke, they changed history. Their testimonies rewrote the margins, filled the silences, demanded recognition. They forced the world to see that war was not only medals and maps, but scars and silence, survival and shame. Their voices became the missing pages of history books, the echoes that refused to die. Even today, when I hear recordings of women breaking their silence, my body shivers. Their words cut deeper than any document, because they carry the tremor of truth, the crack of memory, the courage of survival. Each word is a scar speaking, alive, demanding to be remembered. The voice that finally spoke is not only theirs, it is ours too. Every time we tell their stories, every time we refuse forgetting, we carry their voices forward. Their scars become sound through us. Their silence becomes testimony through our memory. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that silence was not the end. Speaking was. And when they finally spoke, history itself shifted. Because truth once voiced cannot be buried again. The truth they don't tell about women in war is that their silence was never absence. It was survival. Their scars were not weakness. They were memory. And though history wrote their names in margins, if at all, the truth of their endurance remains. The final scar, the deepest truth, is this. Without women, there would be no tomorrow. And yet their war has always been hidden, their voices muffled, their survival dismissed. I remember the first time I realized how deeply their truth had been buried. I was reading a history book filled with maps, dates, generals, battles. It spoke of victory and defeat, of nations rising and falling. But it said nothing of the women who carried water to basements, who sang lullabies through hunger, who hid letters under floorboards. It did not mention the women who planted seeds in ashes, who lifted rubble with trembling arms, who shielded children with their own bodies. That absence was louder than the words on the page. The silence itself was accusation. The truth they don't tell is that women carried wars inside them long after the guns went silent. They carried hunger into abundance, silence into laughter, fear into love. They carried memories into their children's bones, their grandchildren's habits. The war did not end. It lived in them, and it lives in us. Their scars are our inheritance, whether we see them or not. I once asked my mother why she never told me the whole story. She looked at me for a long time, her eyes shadowed, her lips pressed thin. Finally, she whispered, "Because the truth is too heavy." And yet, in her silence, she told me everything. The weight she carried was visible in her hands, her posture, her sleepless nights. The truth did not need words. It lived in her body, in her silence, in the way she held me too tightly. The truth they don't tell is that women's survival was not gentle. It was fierce, it was painful, it was costly. They endured not because they were unbroken, but because they refused to vanish. Their scars are proof of that refusal. They never healed, but perhaps they were never meant to. Healing would imply forgetting, and forgetting would be betrayal. Some women, in their final years, spoke truths they had carried for decades. They told their children of nights they could not erase, of hunger that still burned in their bones, of shame that was never theirs but lived in them like poison. Their words were heavy, but they were liberation too. With each voice that finally spoke, history shifted. Each scar named was a wound refusing to be erased. The truth they don't tell is that women were not merely victims. They were creators of life in the midst of death, keepers of dignity in the midst of ruin, soldiers of survival in the midst of destruction. They were warriors whose battlefield was hunger, whose weapon was song, whose shield was silence, whose victory was simply to remain. I think of the images I carry, the mother sitting beside an empty cradle, the woman with a scar across her face calling it her medal, the grandmother humming lullabies behind barbed wire, the child clutching a photograph of a mother who never returned. These images are not written in history, but they are carved into memory. They are the truth behind the silence. The truth they don't tell is that women rebuilt the world. They did it quietly, invisibly, without recognition. They built homes, schools, families, futures. They stitched together the fabric of life after it had been torn apart. Their hands carried us forward. Their voices, even silenced, guided us. Their scars gave us the world we stand in, and so, the truth they don't tell about women in war is also the truth we must carry. We must speak their silence, honor their scars, remember their survival. Because if we do not, we betray them a second time. I once heard an old woman say, "We were never asked to tell our story, but it is still here in my bones." Her words echo in me still. The truth they don't tell is alive in every scar, every silence, every habit, every song. It is our duty to listen, to carry it forward, to refuse forgetting. The war left ruins, but women left tomorrow. That is the truth. It was never told in books, never spoken in speeches, never carved into monuments. But it is written in us, in our blood, in our silence, in our survival. Their scars remain unhealed, unforgettable. And perhaps that is the way it should be. Because the truth they don't tell about women in war is the truth that keeps memory alive. They suffered. They endured. They carried us all. And though history chose silence, their scars